in order to impose the lockdown, they needed an illusion of consensus that the scientific community was in favor of lockdown. And if prominent epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, Oxford are saying that it's not a consensus, well, that's a huge problem for the policymakers that are pushing the lockdown.
So you're out in the world, you're at let's say some family gathering, and you bump into someone who's completely apartisan, doesn't engage in politics professionally, doesn't consume the news, doesn't have social media. And it just comes up naturally over the course of the conversation that you are critical of the standard pandemic response. How do you explain to that person what the essence of your position is?
The main ideas are so simple that it's amazing to me that they're controversial. First, there are huge amounts of evidence that there's this risk stratification in who's actually at risk from COVID itself, right? So the disease has killed, 80% of the people are over the age of 65, 40% of people who died are in nursing homes. It's really this huge risk for people that are older. And for young people, it's much, much, much less of a risk. Very few children have died from this relative to other risks in kids' lives. And so that's the first thing. Like, it's not equally risk everybody.
Right.
The second thing, and again, this should be utterly non-controversial, the lockdowns have been really damaging. They've hurt the life circumstances of children who've had schools closed, of the poor, the working class. Small businesses have been destroyed, and that's just in richer parts of the world, like the United States. Psychologically, I think everyone that's experienced the last 2.5 years can understand at a deep level how damaging these policies have been to creating anxiety on a huge scale. You put those two together, my pandemic views are very simple. Let's focus our attention on where the risk actually is. Let's protect older people who are at high risk from this disease with whatever tools we have available to us. And for the rest of society, disrupting the lives of young people so that with this idea that we can somehow use that to protect older people is just wrong. We should stop disrupting the lives of people that are not actually harmed too much by the disease, but are harmed by the policies, and work to protect older people. The idea that disrupting the lives of children to protect older people has just turned out to be completely false.
Right.
And that's it. That's the structure of my views.
Again, if I did a light Googling of your name, though, I get the sense that you're the leader of a death cult. That doesn't sound like a death cult to me, Jay. You seem like a nice guy, and that seems like a pretty fair and even scientific position. Can we say for lockdowns, though? I would have known exactly what you were talking about when I first heard a podcast with you in May of 2020, when that was hard lockdowns. Businesses are shut down. Schools are shut down. 2.5 years later, there's not much in terms of formal shutdown of the economy. When you say lockdowns, does that also encompass kind of voluntary action bred from being systematically misinformed about the nature of COVID?
Yeah, I think my view of what a lockdown actually is any policy aimed at keeping people apart from each other, physically apart, so as to reduce the likelihood of spread of a virus. It's a very broad set of policies that fit under that umbrella.
Right.
So it can include things like mandatory stay-at-home orders, forced business closures, but it can also include essentially like a campaign to maintain high anxiety levels about the virus in the population.
Yeah.
Because that's really what that is. It's about. It's like try to make people aware that being around other people is a danger.
Right.
I think that's a different kind of lockdown, but still nevertheless a lockdown.
And that definition would basically still encompass 2.5 years later the rhetoric you hear from the White House. Yeah. That does what an Anish Jha or whatever is spewing. You could charitably describe it as an incomplete picture of the risk profile of COVID. That kind of is under that conceptual framework of lockdown mentality.
Yeah, I think to try to keep COVID at the forefront of public consciousness, so that it's the primary thing that's in the news for 2.5 years and still going on. Where even wars have trouble displacing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's essentially a policy decision. So you asked me about voluntary responses. The voluntary responses are a response to the perception that people have about the risk that they face in their own life.
Right.
And if you are told that this virus, this pandemic should be the most important thing in your life that you think about all the time, which is essentially the rhetoric of public health the last 2.5 years. I mean, if you have the means, yeah, you're gonna restrict your connection with other people, even people that are close to you in your life.
Right. But I feel like also, I honestly, as someone who's deeply cynical about mainstream narratives on any issue of public importance, the idea that your simple observation that there are other factors worth taking in consideration during a public health response, right, doesn't sound that it's how warped does the world have to be that a simple observation like that lockdowns have economic consequences that need to be weighed against the public health benefits. You might ultimately still make the determination the public health benefits are greater than the costs and therefore it's worth doing, but you have to be willing to openly acknowledge the costs. And I think, like, for the first 2 years of the pandemic, the people that were held up as the divine figures in charge with the preservation of America amidst these ravages, Fauci and Birx and other people, like, literally would never once acknowledge that. And on top of that, people like you, who are just trying to get people to acknowledge those costs, are subjected to cynical witch hunts, right? That's where you're like, wait a minute, something is going wrong with the public conversation.
I mean, the moral structure of the argument that the folks like Fauci or Birx make although they don't actually explicitly say it, is that lives are more important than dollars. And
Right.
So crassly valuing dollars over lives is morally wrong. We need to save lives as much, even if it costs us, filthy lucre, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that logic, is that in fact it's not actually money that's on the other side. The costs are not paid in dollars really, although they are also paid in dollars. They're paid in lives, right? They're paid in the lives of children starving because the economic dislocation caused by the lockdowns means that your family in Uganda can no longer afford to feed its kids. They can't send their kid to school. 4.5 million kids in Uganda are not ever coming back to school. Wow. After 2 years of shut schools. Same in India, the same thing has happened in basically every poor country on earth. People are dead now as a consequence of the lockdown decisions that Western governments took. So on the other side of the costs are not just dollars. We're talking about lives, and many more lives, I think, have been lost as a consequence, and will continue to be lost over time as then were saved on the COVID side.
And so I wanted to ask you about Sri Lanka, right? So there's complete political catastrophe. The government's fallen. It appears that one of the essential elements of the enormous public resentment that enabled for that political catastrophe was just the economic carnage in the wake of lockdowns, where some huge proportion of Sri Lanka's economy is based upon tourism that collapses for 18 months, leading to economic decimation, right? Do you feel like what happened there is to a certain extent a very grotesque vindication of the observations you've been making for a couple years about how maybe lockdowns aren't hurting the economics department at Stanford University, but they might be hurting the kind of the residents of tenement villages in the developing world, right?
The catastrophe in Sri Lanka is absolutely a direct consequence of the lockdown policies that it followed and that the West followed. As you said, the Sri Lankan economy depends very much on trade, on tourism, and when that basically shut down for extended period of time, it left the Sri Lankan economy essentially with very few options, right? So, for instance, I've heard the story that Sri Lanka, the problem is that they adopted these policies to only do organic farming, and that's why. Well, why did they do that? It's because they couldn't get they didn't have like dollars to buy nitrogen from outside. And so they were like making the best of a bad situation by saying, okay, we'll just adopt organic farming, even though that makes no sense in the Sri Lankan setting. The inflation that we're facing around the world, well, we in the United States, we basically spent trillions of dollars funded mostly by money printing and borrowing, which we couldn't afford. And we're like shouldn't be particularly surprised that inflation came out of this. All of these economic harms are a consequence of the lockdown, and all of these economic harms have as follow-on consequences health harms, livelihoods, lives disrupted and destroyed. Those are all on the ledger. You have to mark them on the lockdown side of the ledger. Like they cause the harm directly caused by the policies we adopted.
You're right, exactly. So let me, before we move, you are most famous for being one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Let's go back to the apartisan, non-news consumer, no social media person you bump into at a family gathering. How do you describe to them what the essence of the Great Barrington Declaration is?
So the Great Barrington Declaration is actually just a restatement of the old pandemic plan. It's how we managed a century of respiratory pandemics. Right. The idea is so simple. It almost sounds like it almost sounds like it just can't be that so simple. It has to be something. There has to be something, but there really isn't more. The idea is that you identify who's most at risk based on the features of the virus and the social circumstances in which people live. You move resources to protect them, and disrupts the rest of society as little as possible. Right. That's it. That's the plan. Ultimately, the end point of any pandemic plan, whether it's the Great Barrington Declaration or these lockdowns, is population immunity from respiratory virus pandemics. That's how they end. That doesn't mean the disease goes away. It just means that the population is relatively well protected against it, either by dint of vaccination or prior infection and recovery. And so, don't disrupt society means let kids go to school. Don't close businesses. Right. Do tell people, look, grandma might be at risk when there's high community spread. Maybe go deliver groceries to her. Right. So she doesn't have to go to the grocery store in the meantime. Move resources so that people living in multi-generational homes can have a place to stay when Johnny comes home and says, "Grandma, I might have been exposed to COVID," so they can call up public health and be offered a place to stay for a while. The grandma can offer a place to stay for a little while, or maybe Johnny. Yeah. And then don't move COVID-infected patients back to nursing homes to spread the infection there. Seems like a really silly thing, right? But we actually did that. And we actually killed people. Yeah. Because of that, it wasn't an evil thing. It wasn't evil that did this. It was actually a bad idea that did this. The idea that we needed to protect hospitals more than we needed to protect vulnerable older people. Right. That's the Great Barrington Declaration.
So you're saying that people were excessively focused on the risk of hospital overflow and insufficiently focused on protecting the people that we knew were at the highest risk. But how early do you think we knew that it had this age distribution to it? Maybe because someone who's trying to, combat your position might say, okay, well, back then, though, we thought that it was the new plague that was universally threatening to everybody. How do you actually, could we have actually known at the time that there was this age differential?
Yeah, I mean, it was really clear in the data at the time, right? So if you looked at the Chinese data that was coming out with rapid publications in January, February 2020, that there was this massive age spread. Yeah. Almost all of the people that were dying in China were old. There was this ship, the Diamond Princess. Yeah. This cruise ship, which very famously bounced around from port to port. No one would take them because it had COVID in them. A lot of the people in there got COVID. A few of them died. Almost all of the people that died were over the age of 70. It was very clear from the data that were coming out in the early days that there's an age stratification that's even steeper than the age stratification for the flu, the deaths from the flu. Wow. And so that, and my colleague at Harvard, who co-wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with me, Martin Kulldorff, wrote a piece arguing for that. From the data that he was looking at out of China, and he couldn't get it published anywhere. He ended up publishing on his LinkedIn LinkedIn follows blog. He wrote, and John Ioannidis did an analysis of that Diamond Princess. He published it in Stat News and almost got canceled. John Ioannidis is one of the most famous scientists in the world here at Stanford University, my colleague, making just this basic observation, like, look, there is this age stratification. Like when you have a disease, almost any disease, what you want to do is you want to understand the risk factors that play into what makes people really at risk. Then you can really start to understand where to put resources to try to address it. It's not just for respiratory pandemics. Right. This is a principle of medicine. We basically forgot that.
But has anyone even, let's say, put aside everything else, someone still is reading the top 4 links that come up when they Google your names. They still think that you are in fact the leader of this death cult, whatever. You and the other Great Barrington Declaration people were very early in critiquing school closures, very early. 2 years later, there's almost universal agreement that school closures were an absolute catastrophe, right? That at the same time, the most vocal proponents of racial justice in 2022 America were vigorously supporting school closures, which we now know dramatically exacerbated racial achievement gaps, right? Same people with the BLM signs are also the people that are shutting down the schools, driving these achievement gaps, and also depriving poor kids of color of a safe place that they can get 3 meals a day, right? Just insane, an insane warped world. If people buy nothing else, does anyone at least send you like a nice email every once in a while to say, you know what, you were at least right about schools. You were right about schools. I'm sorry I called you a member. I still think you are the leader of a death cult, but you guys were very early on the school closures. Everybody, including the New York Times editorial page, agrees that that was a mistake. No one apologizes to you.
I mean, I don't. The end point isn't necessarily an apology. I do think that we have to adopt policies and structures so that we never do this again.
Right.
I'd rather have that than an apology, frankly. I think the people that push the school closures, I think many of them, as you say, Rob, have started to understand that it was a big mistake, and some of them are trying to look for ways to claim that they were always in favor of keeping schools open. It's just dishonest, right? Like, I think if they would actually have a better chance of like getting. Getting the public trust back if they would just say, look, we got it deeply wrong. Like Sweden, they kept the schools open through the whole pandemic. Like they kept, for like kids up to age 15, no school closures ever, no restrictions on behavior, no masks, no social distancing, nothing, and no kids died. I think in that spring at all in Sweden from the pandemic, and the teachers actually had lower rates of COVID than the rest of the population, the rest of the other workers in the population.
Can you give us a peek into how your fellow academics have treated you over the course of the last couple of years? As I mentioned in my email to you, I don't get the impression that as a whole they've engaged you with civic, evidence-based counter-arguments, that perhaps they've been doing something other than that. What's it been like?
It's been a nasty...
You're not a woe is me type person, but you can be a little self-indulgent here. If you can paint a picture for us about what it's been like for you.
I'm an academic, as you know, Rob, and I've been part of being in science and academics is you have disputes with other academics over ideas. That's just normal.
Right.
I've been involved in those kinds of academic fights before, where usually it involves dueling papers. I write a paper, 2 years later someone else writes a paper, 2 years after that I write another paper.
Right. And
when we meet each other in the halls, we have a fun time discussing who's right and who's wrong.
Right.
I mean, that's a normal part of academics. What I've been through the last 2.5 years is so far outside that normal. It's hard to describe. Right? Maybe I can describe it with just a couple of like incidents. So after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, I started getting hate mail from other academics. Like essentially, some of them, some very nasty, death cult like kinds of accusations. It's like academics I didn't know. There were a lot of academics who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, scientists, epidemiologists who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, some of whom lost their jobs for signing it. people who lost grant opportunities, that were shunned by their colleagues. In December of 2020, a few months after the Great Barrington Declaration, the former president of Stanford University, wrote to me asking if I would be willing to have a debate or discussion with somebody on the other side from Stanford, who were in favor of lockdowns in December of 2020. This is the former president of Stanford University asking me to do that. I, of course, jumped at the chance, but he couldn't find someone on the other side. Even before the Great Barrington Declaration, I worked on a study called the Santa Clara Seroprevalence Study. The idea of that study was to measure how many people in the population, and this is in April of 2020, how many people in the population around here in Santa Clara County, and also one in LA County, how many had antibodies that suggested they'd already been infected. Yeah. We found that the disease was, something like 40 times more people had been infected than had come to the attention of public health. I meant that the infection fatality rate for people in the community was something like 2 out of 1,000 rather than 3 out of 100 or 4 out of 100, which is the World Health Organization was saying. This is like there were like these hit pieces that people did on me by.
that was important. Can you explain why is it that would matter that a lot more people had infection than we previously thought?
Well, so that means that first, the death rates were much lower than we previously thought. So, like, you can calibrate then what the level of response ought to be to it. Second, it verified the finding that there's this risk stratification. It was really older people that were dying from it. It also meant that the disease was pretty widespread in what we found is about 4% prevalence in LA County, 3% prevalence in Santa Clara County. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that means there's no chance of zero COVID. Lockdowns are never going to get you down to zero. All of those policies then are no longer, that can't be the goal any longer. So the pushback on this was absolutely remarkable inside both the Stanford and the broader scientific community. They had a statistician who told the New York Times that I should apologize for running this study. I had people. I've been publishing in scientific journals for 20 plus years, and including like statistical methods and stuff. People convinced I didn't know how to do basic statistics. And
a tenured professor at Stanford University.
And John Ioannidis was also on the study. The whole thing was like crazy. Eventually the study got published in the International Journal of Epidemiology. Then we had some of my colleagues went to the press to try to attack me. Including this BuzzFeed story saying where my colleagues were attacking me, saying we used a bad test kit, all stuff they had no idea that had no chance of knowing was true. Yeah. Because they didn't like the result. They didn't like that it was me leading the study instead of them. I guess I'm not sure exactly what motivated them, but it was really nasty. They went after my family. There was press that went after my family. There were allegations made about false ones about taking funding, the JetBlue founder gave $5,000 to Stanford for the study, and this BuzzFeed author wrote this piece claiming that somehow that I'd taken $5,000 and changed the results of the study, even though the money went to Stanford and the money came after the study was done. It was $5,000 out for a study. It was like a $100,000 study. The whole thing was just
selling yourself for the filthy lucre, or maybe not, Can I just back up? I just want to make it clear to the audience. So, the former head of Stanford University, one of the most prestigious universities on planet Earth, says the point of higher ed is to have elite minds with decades of training, who have different ideas, have those ideas clash against each other in the free market. Have those ideas clash against each other in an open exchange, and from that clash will emerge truth. We are we're a couple months into a once-in-a-generation pandemic. We have elite minds on both sides of this issue. We're going to try to bring them together to have this clash of ideas in which we can generate the truth. And he can't find anyone willing to be on the other side of a debate with you. Yeah. No one will do it.
Yeah. Still to this date, I have not had that open discussion with other people in public at Stanford. I've had that opportunity in some other places, but not at Stanford.
Okay. So here, they've not hosted any debates with you, with your most fierce critic. Here's an open forum. People can ask as many pointed questions of you as they want. They have not done it. And you're willing to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've talked with almost anyone that's willing to talk with you, Rob. In March of 2021, I did this roundtable invited by Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. And one of the topics that came up that Governor DeSantis asked me about was about masks, about masking children, whether it was effective in slowing the disease spread, what evidence was there that masks actually were an effective disease control mechanism when you applied them to children in schools. And I told him the fact, which is that there is no randomized evidence at all that masking children stops disease spread. And lots of reasons to think that probably wouldn't, because kids aren't particularly effective at wearing masks. Yeah. And in fact, I think we did a podcast about this. The faculty, some of the epidemiology faculty here circulated a secret petition asking the president of the university, the current president, to censor me. So by this time I was a little more prepared. Like I had some folks who I told about this, and they went and asked the president of the university whether he was wanting to censor me, and he said no, we believe in academic freedom, and then the petition went away. It's been really stressful, I have to say. Like I in the early days of the pandemic, I was not really prepared for this kind of nasty attacks, sometimes from my colleagues, using the press to essentially to shame me. I was filled with anxiety. I lost 30 pounds of anxiety. I was going to write a diet book, how to lose 30 pounds during a pandemic. All you have to do is like get yourself in the public eye, take pieces of it put at you. I've gained some of it back, which is actually a good thing.
That's unfortunate, yeah. Well, so let's talk about Florida. You mentioned it. One of the grotesque caricatures of you and your colleagues is that you just wanted to let the virus rip in the early stages, just like weed out the weak ones. It's some Ayn Randian vision that only the alpha ubermensch will emerge. You guys, I don't want to overstate it, but you basically you heavily influenced the COVID response policies in Florida. It was not let it rip. What was it? It
was focused protection. Right? I think Governor DeSantis understood that it was really older people that were at risk. And he moved resources to try to protect nursing homes, reduce the amount of traffic in and out of nursing homes in the early days of the pandemic. He didn't send COVID-infected patients back to nursing homes for them to spread the infection. It moved in the early days. There wasn't a lot of masks in some settings can work, right? So move high quality masks into nursing homes so that the staff there could have access to them. He also was humane. He's Florida passed a law, and Governor DeSantis signed, allowing visitors, because really you have to balance the protection of the old against COVID, but also in these settings, but also against loneliness, which has killed a lot of patients in nursing home settings. Of course. So I think for him, focused protection of the vulnerable was the main watchword. When the vaccine came available, he actually called me and asked me about vaccine prioritization in Florida, and this was his instinct, and I reinforced it, that really you should prioritize the old. The vaccine, if it does anything, is protected against severe disease and death. And so by the end of January, a very large fraction of the older population in Florida had already been vaccinated. Whereas in California, my mom's 83, lives in LA County, she still hadn't been vaccinated, because the prioritization was just much more lax and hard to, not specific toward the old. I think Florida, it's a difficult disease to stop and protect people from, but Florida did about as well as any place could. And as a result, the results are that the age-adjusted death rate from COVID are roughly in line with what they are in California. The excess mortality rate, excess meaning mortality above and beyond what would be expected given 2018, 2019 norms, is actually lower in Florida for the population at large than it is in California.
The idea that it's DeSantis just letting it rip, it's I can just tell friends of mine in San Francisco, he actually created these little Delta squads of National Guards men to go out and supplement the staff at the nursing homes to ensure that there was limited access in, and that they had enough support staff to protect the seniors that are in these retirement communities. That's not let it rip. Just appropriately proportioning resources, limited resources for the people that we know are the highest risk.
Yeah. The other side of it was also Florida followed really well is for young people to disrupt their lives as little as possible. So I was an expert witness in a lawsuit that the Florida Department of Education advising that lawsuit where the unions, the Florida Teachers Union, sued Governor DeSantis and the Department of Education to keep the schools closed in 2020. Like so he decides in like July of 2020 that he's open the schools. In the fall, they sue the Florida Teachers Union sue, and I think I was the only expert they could find on this side. Now I'm quite proud of having been part of that. But we won that case not at the district court level. We lost, and then it went to appeal and we won. I look back at the experts on the other side, and I wonder if they're proud of what they did. They were not actually talking what the science was actually showing. I wouldn't have agreed to participate in the lawsuit if I hadn't been reading these papers that suggested that it was pretty safe, much safer than closing the schools for kids to have to be in school.
Right.
And I think.
Well, can I say your thing about the elderly also is there's something profound within that though, where you want to do whatever you can to protect them from a virus we know that is much worse for them than the seasonal flu. Okay, it's obviously much worse. But at a certain point, you can completely engineer out all risk and also in so doing, engineer out the reason to live in the first place, right? I have a 90-year-old grandmother in San Francisco, now totally vaccinated and boosted, but I know she was willing to risk seeing some family members because that's the reason that she wants to live in the first place, right? And it's like there are a lot of 89-year-olds that would say you get to live for another year or you get to see your grandchildren and there's a chance you might die. A lot of them would take that second option, right? Of course they would.
I would take that second option in a minute, Rob. It wouldn't even be close.
It's like, what's the point? The point of existing is not just to... there's a reason why it's worth existing, and that's basically what it is. And you deprive people of that during these authoritarian restrictions, right?
I before the pandemic, I'd been working on social isolation and health in the elderly. I published some papers on this, and findings are really consistent. If you're socially isolated as an older person, you tend to be in worse health. It's not the health problems that cause the social isolation. Your social isolation then subsequently leads to worse health outcomes. Yeah. In the UK, they actually put a cabinet level position called the Minister of Loneliness. It's a real problem. And I think that kind of balancing is at the heart of what public health ought to be. That kind of balancing of objectives, taking into account what people's life circumstances are, what their goals are, and also the plurality of life circumstances and goals really ought to be how public health acts. Right. That's been the major problem to me about the pandemic in terms of how public health is. It's operated in this sort of monomaniacal way where the only problem people face is the protection against this one virus and not all of the myriad other problems that people face to their health.
Exactly. Let's get into some of the critiques of the work that you can respond to. And again, as I acknowledged to you, the vast majority of the critiques of you in the Great Barrington Declaration have been bad faith tribal nonsense, right? There's not been an abundance of evidence-based pushback. You kind of have to weed through the internet to find it. I found some, and I just want to provide the cleanest articulation of those critiques and have you respond to them, okay? So, first one, you and your co-authors you ultimately underestimated the COVID death toll, and when you published the Great Barrington Declaration, as part of that, you guys essentially downplayed the likelihood of future COVID spikes, and there actually were spikes. You guys incorrectly predicted the future, and therefore incorrectly predicted the death toll and carnage of COVID.
Okay, so I did that Santa Clara study that we talked about earlier in order to find out how risky COVID actually is, right? To measure the infection fatality rate of it. I did not make any projections about the total number of deaths. I wrote an op-ed in March of 2020 saying we didn't know exactly what the death toll can be because we don't yet know the mortality rate. Like it could be low, it could be really high, and we really can't operate in this kind of scientific uncertainty. I was calling for a study to try to resolve it, a study that I ultimately ran.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it seems like a really unfair criticism to say like I didn't know what the death rate was. In fact, when I participated actively in the scientific pursuit of trying to understand what the death rate actually is, and it turned out one of the most highly cited serial prevalence studies is still that Santa Clara study and the LA County study I ran. As far as like predicting whether there were going to be future waves,
Right.
that's also false. The reason we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration is because we knew there were going to be future waves. We have no capacity to stop this disease from spreading. This disease is here forever, and we knew that that was true in October 2020 when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. Right. The reason we wrote it is because we also saw that the response was going to be another lockdown, which it ultimately was. In fact, when we wrote it, there were like some people saying, well, the lockdowns are a straw man, no one's actually supporting them. And then a month later, those same people are proposing a lockdown. Yeah. So the issue wasn't whether a wave was coming. I mean, we knew a wave was coming. I mean, there was no purpose. If we thought a wave wasn't going to come, we just would have stayed silent or would have said, oh, look, there's no wave coming. We may as well just shut down and go away, let it rip. We argued for focused protection because we knew a wave was coming. And now it's clear, right? Like almost 2 years on, and you can see wave after wave still happening. What's different, and this is the thing we actually did predict correctly in the Great Barrington Declaration, is that the population is more widely, there's more population immunity than there was 2 years ago, right? When the virus first hit the world, very few people had any protection, if anybody had any protection against it.
Right.
Now, a very large fraction of the population has had COVID and recovered, or have had the vaccine. And through those mechanisms, they're now protected against severe disease from COVID. The second and third infections are much less likely to produce hospitalization, much less likely to produce death, even in the old, than it was 2 years ago, because of population immunity. That's one of the key ideas in the Great Barrington Declaration, right. And that's which has come true. So I guess I'd say both of those criticisms are inconsistent with the facts and to a large extent unfair.
Okay. Have you ever actually heard the words natural immunity uttered from Anthony Fauci's lips? Is like this is the algorithm that runs him? Does it even know how to pair those two words together?
I think he's had to acknowledge that there is
such a thing.
Yeah, that but
he dare not speak it. It's like Voldemort. You can't say that actually is something that does happen.
It's been interesting to see that like how public health people have dealt with this fact, right? So after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, there was a group of epidemiologists and scientists that wrote a piece called the John Snow Memorandum.
Yeah.
John Snow, being one of the world's most famous epidemiologists in the I think 17th century, 18th century, predicted that 17th century predicted that cholera was spread by some essentially an agent that you could identify, and not just it's not just in the air. Like he identified a water pump in London, where he thought cholera was spreading, and shut down the water pump, the cholera goes away. And they wrote a memorandum premised on the idea that everyone's at risk from COVID, that there is no protection provided by COVID recovery, no immunity really, and that lockdowns really are the only way because you couldn't do focused protection of the old. So the John Snow Memorandum was a article that was published in a very prominent medical journal called The Lancet. It was published shortly after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration as a response to it. And it was premised on the idea that there was really no immunity after infection. We couldn't know for certain if there was immunity after infection and recovery. That lockdowns were the only way to protect the population at large. That you couldn't actually do focused protection of the vulnerable, and that a vaccine might be coming.
Right.
And a lot of very prominent people signed, including the current head of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky. It was based on a scientific falsity, the idea that there was no immunity after infection. There was a ton of evidence in October of 2020 that was not true. the scientific community sort of like the scientific bureaucrats sort of align themselves around this idea in order to combat the Great Barrington Declaration. It was actually remarkable. Like just a few days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, wrote an email to Tony Fauci, calling me, Martin Kulldorff, and Sunetra Gupta, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford. We call us fringe epidemiologists.
Yeah.
I have a business card somewhere where I have now a fringe epidemiology is the main title.
And he also, the email is basically like, we got to snuff these guys out.
Yeah, so he called for a devastating published takedown of the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration. Right?
And that's what the Johnstone Memorandum was intended to be.
Yeah, that was the purpose of it, is to say, look, the scientific community has a consensus. It's not the Great Barrington Declaration. The Great Barrington Declaration posed an enormous threat to the scientific bureaucrats that were pushing lockdown. The problem was that in order to impose the lockdown, they needed an illusion of consensus that the scientific community was in favor of lockdown. And if prominent epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, Oxford are saying that it's not a consensus, there are tens of thousands of epidemiologists around the world and scientists around the world signing on to the Great Barrington Declaration, well, that's a huge problem for the policymakers that are pushing the lockdown. And they solved it essentially by marginalizing it, calling us fringe, essentially sicking the press after us. Like I started getting reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip. Why am I leading a death cult, right? When I never said the word "let it rip," it's not in the Great Barrington Declaration. I never even thought it, Rob. My goal in the Great Barrington Declaration was focus, protection of the vulnerable, the old. They needed to create this propaganda war against this idea because it was the old pandemic plan that they were arguing against. They knew it too.
Right. But this is where it gets very warped world, where I don't think there was necessarily coordination, but the idea that the public health authorities have an agenda to discredit you, and then essentially all prestige media dutifully carries out their propaganda efforts as opposed to being skeptical third parties is disappointing and a little bit frightening, right? It's like they're given a certain level of talking points. J. Bhattacharya, he might look like a nice Christian man, actually the head of a death cult, wants to let it rip and wants to snuff out grandma because she's weak and doesn't fit his Ayn Rand vision of the Ubermensch. And everybody just regurgitates that indefinitely. And even when they ask you explicitly in an email, do you want to let it rip, and you say no, they don't correct the record. So what is happening here?
It's propaganda, right? I think if you want to get your way with a remarkable policy that's going to devastate the lives of so many poor people, and a lot of people are really opposed to it, but they can't really oppose it because they don't have the scientific background. And a whole bunch of scientists say, look, you don't need to do this. You can do a different policy, focus protection. How do you get your way, right?
Right.
I think it was sharp-elbowed politics. The fact that the media went along with it, so much of the media went along with it, is actually disquieting. I think the media itself also is subject to this kind of propaganda, right? They were, instead of being independent third parties asking questions like you are about whether it actually makes sense, instead they decided that they were going to be essentially cheerleaders for the government position.
Another critique of the Great Barrington Declaration is, okay, everybody's going to get infected. It's better to get infected after the vaccines have been invented, so it reduces your chance of being hospitalized. That's why it's okay to take on the short-term pain of lockdown now to prevent people from being infected so that we can wait until those vaccines are invented. And you guys, the authors, radically underestimated how quickly the vaccines would come out, and that's what led you to have a more open. So it mattered that you guys underestimated how quickly the vaccines would come, Because if you knew that they were just around the corner, you would have been more pro-lockdown. That's the critique.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some strength to that critique. Absolutely, some strength to that critique. Like one of the major things I think I got wrong during the pandemic is that in March of 2020, I did not think that it would be possible to develop an effective vaccine in 9 months. It's unprecedented in history to develop a vaccine and deploy it at scale so rapidly.
Right.
The key thing in October of 2020 is that we don't know if the vaccine is going to work. We still don't know. I knew there was a big trial ongoing. We don't know the result of it, and yet we still wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, right? There's no guarantee that it's going to work. Thank God, it turns out it actually does work to some extent. But then the question comes up: how do you use the vaccine? Right. Let's leave that aside for a second. There's one other piece of this I really want to nail down before we talk about how the vaccine is used. The lockdown harms, that critique is premised on this idea that the lockdowns are just a thing that you can just deal with for a few months and it's fine. That is a very classist kind of idea. Turns out that very small fraction of the world's population can actually cope with a lockdown. Right, in the U.S., there's some estimate like 25 to 30% of the population have jobs that could actually be replaced by work from home. It means the rest of the population has to work, or they lose their jobs, or I guess you get stimulus checks, but still it comes with its own costs. So the lockdown harms, it's not just a trivial small thing that we all can put up with together. It means, you poor person living in Bangladesh, you starve. Right, so it's not just a simple thing where we wait, right? So I think and the second aspect of that is that it's a gamble. Just like I said, we don't know for a fact if the vaccine is going to work or not. If it does work, great, you can use it for focus protection, right? So I think that the logic of that has some power to it, but it's still the right decision to not lock down. It's still the right decision to do focus protection, just from a overall saving people's lives kind of perspective. Now let me come back to the vaccines and how you use them. The vaccine trials, the endpoint that they had was prevention of symptomatic infection. Prevention of symptomatic infection. The famous result from the trials at 3 or 4 months after you are fully vaccinated, it's a 95% protection against symptomatic infection. That actually is not epidemiologically meaningful. Because there's two kinds of things which would be. Like one would be that it protects against severe disease, right? It protects against you going to the hospital. The trials didn't answer that question because they weren't sufficiently powered, didn't have enough people in them to answer that question. They didn't have enough old people in them, frankly, to answer that question. I wrote a piece in December of 2020 when the vaccines came out with Sinatra Group saying, look, if it prevents symptomatic infection, it probably also prevents severe disease. We should use it for focus protection. Vaccinate the old, and then lift the lockdowns immediately. I think that would have been the right policy, right? But now that we have the vaccine, the right thing to do is use it for focus protection, get rid of the lockdowns. Instead, we've spent a year and a half since then suffering through all of this nonsense, even after we vaccinated the old. Yeah. The other idea is that it could have been useful to stop the disease from spreading in the first place. That turns out not to be true. The vaccine does not stop people from getting infected. It doesn't stop people from spreading the disease. Much of public health latched onto that idea, and they bet that it would stop disease transmission.
Fauci did, right? I mean,
yeah, Fauci did. Yeah. In fact, the World Health Organization, after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, changed its definition of herd immunity to say vaccine-induced immunity only counts. I mean, you have this it's crazy, right? They put all of their eggs in the vaccine stopping transmission basket. That's how we're going to stop the disease from spreading. You vaccinate enough people, the disease goes away. Give Fauci a Nobel Prize, and we're all happy, right? Yeah. The problem was they made a bet based on incomplete evidence that turned out to be wrong. It doesn't stop transmission. So even after the vaccines came, focus protection was the right thing to do. So the critique that the Great Barrington Declaration didn't account for the vaccines is, I think, naive. In fact, Even after the vaccines, the right thing to do is focus protection. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for this uncertainty to get resolved, it's not the right thing to do to lockdown, because it's harming so many poor people, so many vulnerable people. It's just unethical.
Right. And I guess like basically Biden's COVID infection is a case study in the limits and benefits of the vaccine, right? Like he's fully boosted up, is as socially, as isolated as one can be, right? Given his public position, still gets it, still's infected, but by all accounts, it's extremely mild, right? It's a very mild, and even though he's in the high risk category, he's not in the hospital. Another major critique of the Great Barrington Declaration is that it's effectively impossible to isolate immunocompromised or the elderly or other people that are high at risk. That's nice in theory, but in practice, there's just way too much intermingling outside of, let's say, isolated anomalous instances like retirement communities to effectively do focused protection. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also is a important critique to think about, and completely valid in one sense. Like it's a difficult challenge, and in some places it may be impossible. Like for instance, in very, very poor countries, where people there's not that many older people, they live in large homes where there are not many resources. It may actually be impossible. Yeah. There, a lockdown doesn't work either, right? Because you can't really shut down someone who makes $2 a day of income. What you cause them to do is to starve. Yeah. Right. So there you just have a very difficult. But in rich countries, there actually are opportunities, I think, if people put their minds to it. The key thing is that it has to be a local decision, so it has to be like local public health, who understands the local living circumstances of the elderly population, of the high-risk population in the community, devising creative ways to have that happen. Right. So Great Barrington Declaration, we propose some ideas, right? So for instance, the nursing homes, it's not even, if the nursing homes you bring up, that's not a trivial thing. I mean, that's 40% of the deaths are in the nursing homes. If we just secured nursing homes better, we could have avoided a very large fraction of the mortality that came from COVID. And they're very simple ideas, right? So like a lot of the problems in nursing homes happened not just from sending COVID-infected patients back in, but also because there's staff people who work in the nursing homes who come in and out of the nursing homes and actually work in multiple nursing homes. We could have restricted that from happening. Like we could have changed the workforce in nursing homes to say, okay, well, if you're going to work in nursing homes during this pandemic, it's more like a residential job, right? And you stay there. Like in the old-fashioned days, the doctors used to live in the hospital campus. That's why they call them medical residents. So maybe we do that for a short time during the pandemic. Older nursing home workers, of course, then could get paid time off. Actually, we could have done that for workers in the community at large. If you're an older worker, you're an Uber driver or whatever it is, we spent $6 trillion. We could have given sabbatical time during periods of high transmission to older workers instead of asking them to go get exposed. We could have organized communities so that, and this actually happened in places like Sweden, where you if you know someone that's older living next door to you, you offer to go get groceries for them. Like instead of, I mean, you had like these COVID, like these elderly only grocery hour or whatever, right? But even then, the older person still has to come out and get exposed to lots of other people. Could have organized that. People live in places where there's multi-generational homes. We could have organized, hotel rooms, make them available for the older person if someone in the household is exposed. I think there's a lot we could have done, and it would depend on the local living circumstances of each community, right? It's going to be a very different response of what focused protection means in Billings, Montana, than it is in downtown LA.
Yeah. Not one size fits all.
Yeah, it couldn't be. But that would have required public health to do an all hands on deck. Let's think creatively how to do this. And a lot of the problem that I saw after the release of the Great Barrington Declaration was public health throwing up its hands and saying it's impossible. I heard those critiques exactly. Yeah. Well, how do they know it's impossible? Why was it more feasible just to lock down whole societies? In what sense did closing schools protect grandma? In fact, a lot of the response exposed grandma. But it's interesting, like the lockdowns themselves were the opposite of focused protection. Like, so for instance, just to give you a concrete thing, where we closed down college campuses. We sent young people home to be with their families, all of a sudden creating multi-generational homes out of whole cloth. We actually made focused protection much more difficult by locking down.
Let me ask one more final critique of the. So this might not be Great Barrington Declaration specific, and I know that you are generally pro-vaccine. I think that people that are critical of COVID tend to get reflexively dismissed as anti-vaxxers. But you've been pretty publicly critical of vaccine mandates. And I guess the counter argument to your critique of vaccine mandates is that, okay, we're willing to acknowledge that the vaccines haven't gone through the normal development safety protocols, but so far the evidence of really severe adverse side effects is minimal. There's a couple demographics, like young men, that might have some elevated risks, but overall they've proven to be extremely effective at the most important thing, which is reducing the risk of hospitalization and death. So why this vigorous opposition, at least to mandates, if not to vaccines themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of vaccines. I think they're the most important medical advance in history. I mean, you could talk me into hand washing and sanitation, I guess. But the thing is that the mandates, let's look at this first from like an economics point of view, right? In economics, there's this idea of a positive externality, which all it means is, like, if I take something and it benefits you, well, I'm going to have like less of an incentive than I ought to take that thing, because I'm not accounting for the benefit I do to you.
Yeah.
Right. That's why vaccines are such a good thing generally. Like if I vaccinate my child for measles, well, not only is my child have a reduction in the risk of getting measles, but also he is less likely to spread it to others because he himself is never going to get it. There's this positive externality. And in that setting, there's sometimes an argument for a mandate. But this vaccine isn't like that. The vaccine does not stop you from getting the disease. In fact, it may be the case that if you compare somebody who's had COVID and recovered, never been vaccinated, actually may pose less of a risk of getting and spreading the disease than someone who has just had the vaccine and never had COVID. The mandates then don't make any economic sense in that sense, because it doesn't have that same positive externality that the traditional vaccines have.
Is there some evidence that if they don't prevent infection, though, they do reduce the risk of infection and transmission?
For a short time, maybe 2 or 3 months or 4 months, I don't know, but certainly not with Omicron, I think. Yeah. I think many people have gotten the vaccine and then gotten infected again. I mean, just anyone listening to this probably knows a crazy number. I mean, I myself was vaccinated in April of 2021, and I got COVID in August of 2021. I mean, I think this vaccine just doesn't have that property that would be necessary in order for you to say, yeah, it makes sense to mandate, because it doesn't have that positive externality. The second thing is a public health point. In this context of deep distrust by the public in public health, you have this mandate which essentially divides the country in two. Right? You have a president who goes around saying that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. You stigmatize the decision to not get vaccinated. You create an underclass. You don't allow them to go to public libraries. You don't allow them to go to restaurants. You essentially create this sort of two-class society around this decision, the mandate, these passports. In that setting, it's this kind of mandate where people lose their jobs over the mandate. You essentially create a situation where people are going to stop trusting public health altogether, large classes of people, and we've seen that happen. It's a total disaster. We've seen now an increase in the number of parents that are not vaccinating their children against measles. We're seeing essentially a decline in trust in public health that's going to have consequences on a whole host of other issues that are really important, that the public continue to trust public health.
So you're saying it's basically they so oversold what it could do, and despite the mounting evidence that they had more limited effects than what we initially thought, that's degraded trust to the point that people are now retroactively questioning other recommendations from those same health bodies.
Exactly. Like once you feel, it's completely legitimate. Like once you feel like you've been lied to, which is essentially
like, what else are you lying to me about?
Exactly. Right? And so I think that kind of, I mean, I call it vaccine fanaticism. Where you, to the point where you say, I'm going to force you to do it, even at the expense of your job, your ability to participate in civic life. It's created this backlash that was entirely predictable, so like there's no argument from I'm benefiting others from it. Right. Point of view. So there's no positive argument you can make for it, and and it has this negative consequence. I just don't understand why so much of public health went behind this idea when in fact, like I'll tell you, like a good example is like look at Sweden, right? They never mandated the vaccine. The key thing is they also never lied to the public.
Yeah.
And so they got enormous uptake of the vaccine as a consequence because the public trusts public health. Why? Because public health trusts the public. You have a symbiotic relationship of trust that results in much better outcomes than a situation in the United States where public health has decided that the public is an enemy.
Wait 1 second, let that go. All right, so let's say you go and you approach one of your beloved fellow faculty members here at Stanford University, and they drive the Tesla and listen to NPR and get the Sunday edition of the New York Times and share their Wordle scores and are, God-fearing Biden voters and have dutifully abided by all the dictates of Fauci. And you say to them, evidence is in, vaccines do not prevent infection. What do they say to you?
A lot of them, they're surprised by that. I don't think they follow the literature very closely. Now, there are people at Stanford who do follow the literature closely that understand this, people like John Ioannidis and a few others. But I've actually been very surprised to see people who really ought to be following literature and looking at it from an open-minded point of view have not really done that as much as they ought to have. And I think this idea that, now I don't think anyone serious thinks the vaccine stops disease spread. I mean, it's so abundantly clear that it doesn't. Yeah. But I'll tell you, Rob, it was clear to me in April of 2021, May of 2021, that wasn't stopping disease spread. Like you saw countries that were heavily vaccinated with big disease outbreaks couldn't be explained unless vaccinated people could get infected. And so, it just took an incredibly long time for the public health community to acknowledge that the vaccinated could get infected and spread the disease. And their response to it, rather than saying, okay, let's definitely not put mandates in place, let's just use the vaccine for focused protection of the old, and other vulnerable people. Instead, they decided that they just needed to double down, get the vaccine in everybody's arms at the point of you lose your job. Yeah. It was incredibly short-sighted from a public health point of view.
How much do you buy this analysis that the long COVID, it has a religious element to it, where some of them, the Tesla NPR addicts, exist in a godless, cold, materialist universe, and COVID to a certain extent provides them a sense of solidarity and the great enemy to combat, and the avoidance of end times, that they don't want to let it go? How much do you think that analysis holds?
I don't know. I mean, I think I try to avoid this kind of psychologizing, I guess. But I'll tell you, I think there's some aspect of what you say is I have seen it. Like and I frankly, if I'm honest, even for me, I felt it. Right, this crisis has provided an opportunity to use my skills in ways that potentially are useful for the world. Mm-hmm. And for many people, that's what they're looking for, right? Like some gives you a purpose and a meaning. I mean, I think there is some aspect of that, certainly in public health and in the public health community, epidemiology community. There's this sense of mission and purpose that COVID created. Yeah. I think even outside of science, there's a lot of people who, it's like a war, right? We in a war, World War II, we're all in it together. Like there's this sense of like common purpose, and if someone like comes along with the Great Barrington Declaration, I've sort of like I've done something really bad because like I started yelling loud obscenities in the middle of
So
a
you said
church
God
service.
is dead. You
Yeah,
said
exactly.
God is dead. The void. You get thrust back into the abyss.
Yeah.
I wouldn't like that either, Jay. So we're working on a documentary right now about kind of this great unanswered mystery of COVID, about why, if the playbook up until COVID hits is the aggressive embrace of repurposed generic drugs, right? So just for people, things that are off patent, that are really cheap, that have an approved medical purpose for a different disease. In the early phases of a pandemic, before you have a vaccine or some other silver bullet solution, aggressively trying out those other alternatives in the early phases. That is something that's been endorsed by basically everyone who ran the COVID pandemic response up until COVID hit. Why is it that the public health establishment and all of its propaganda tentacles so viciously stigmatized any attempts to embrace repurposed drugs, at least over the course of the first 18 months of the pandemic, which in part of our thesis is that perhaps there's a corrupting influence from ubiquitous pharmaceutical company money. Do you think that there is a corrupting influence of ubiquitous pharmaceutical company money?
I mean, I don't think you can avoid worrying about that. I mean, I think, and if you look at the actual actions, and leave aside stuff I don't know, the actual actions of agencies like the FDA have been to fast track drugs put out with a patented drugs. Like probably the best example of this is remdesivir, on the basis of a very weak study to essentially approve it for use, emergency use, almost immediately. And then when it comes to these repurposed, cheap, off-patent drugs that nobody really owns, they've had this incredibly high standard to meet. And I don't know for a fact whether any of those actually work well or not. I mean, I'm sure that some of them work. I mean, a lot. There's some where there's like, it seems like there's good randomized studies that show they work, and some where there's like it probably doesn't work. It's something that gets resolved over time. But the standard of evidence used to approve drugs like remdesivir, it's impossible to look at it and say that they used a high standard of evidence. They just didn't. Whereas for drugs like fluvoxamine, vitamin D, the standard of evidence is incredibly high.
Right. Or even ivermectin, most notoriously. And even if you think that ivermectin doesn't work, which it may not, the idea that it was a dramatically higher standard, and anyone who is an advocate for it is a horse deworming addict. Yeah, it's like, man, it either does or doesn't work. You don't need to call me names, right?
Well, it's just a strange thing. So, like, one thing that I think the dynamic in this pandemic, which maybe didn't really play a role in earlier pandemics, the possibility of a very early vaccine may have played a role in this, right? So you have a vaccine that's being tested. That's going to the randomized trials will be done in 6, 7, 8, 9 months from now, and if it works, it's going to need to. Usually, it takes a while to get full approval. You might get emergency approval, but if there's already a drug that kind of works, then it's harder to get emergency approval. You may want in fact, often what will happen in those kind of situations is the FDA will go back and say, okay, you did a protocol where you had an unvaccinated placebo, but they didn't get this drug that kind of worked. I want you to rerun the trial against that. It just makes it more complicated to get the vaccine approved for use at scale. And so I've wondered a little about that, like whether that played a role in some people's thinking over how much investment there ought to be in early treatment. I think it's a scandal. I think the NIAID, Tony Fauci's group, should have invested as much effort in the assessment, the rapid assessment of early treatments as it did on the vaccine.
And but its pharma money is literally everywhere. Like, it's in media companies, it's in the health regulators, it's in the research institutions, it's everywhere. And I guess I don't want to unfairly characterize your position on it, But it's basically mine, which is even if you can't figure out the exact mechanism of corruption, when it's so ubiquitous and there's a track record which so clearly is in favor of lucrative brand name drugs, you start to become ever so slightly suspicious. I think is basically your position, which is mine as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not like the pharmaceutical companies have a pristine history, right? So
Yeah.
it's, like in the early 2000s, there was this drug called Vioxx that was on the market that was used as a painkiller for kind of like a replacement for ibuprofen, because the properties were that it was less bleeding in the stomach. Based on the biological mechanism. It turns out that the drug causes strokes and heart attacks in certain fraction of the people that take it. And that Merck actually hid this fact, that they kind of knew it and hid it. When the lawsuits finally sort of played itself out, it turns out that Merck used its power to marginalize and destroy the careers of scientists that brought that up. Even within the FDA, it was difficult to turn out to be. It took a whistleblower inside the FDA to actually make the call that it caused these side effects. You have a history here. It's not like you have to worry about it.
Yeah. And it's this warped world where the people that would have been most susceptible, most likely to lob that critique of pharmaceutical companies having nefarious motives and potentially using like these dark arts to snuff out critics are now under COVID times, the most vigorous boosters of pharmaceutical companies. You're like, you can just retain a certain level of skepticism and cynicism, but it's all out the window as now that we're in this new age of this grand battle.
Well, I mean, the pharmaceutical companies have a very important role to play in the health of the world population. They have made enormous advances in science that have really helped people. At the same time, there are these incentives. I think a honest proponent of the pharmaceutical industry would ask for there to be this honest evaluation so that it reduces the incentives to engage in these kinds of activities, these sort of more salacious activities by the pharmaceutical companies, because they know that there's a watchdog watching. Yeah. As soon as you lift up the possibility of there being someone watching you, bad things can happen. I mean, I just think it's good for everybody to have these kinds of questions get asked in real time.
Yeah, exactly. What is your prediction for how the pandemic plays out over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, we have no technology to stop this disease from spreading. We have no technology to eradicate it. The vaccine doesn't stop you from getting or spreading the disease. Lockdowns don't stop you from getting or spreading the disease. We have no technology to stop this disease from spreading. It is, at this point, endemic in the world population. It is here to stay forever. And it's very clearly seasonal. So in every winter, you can expect there to be a COVID season in the indefinite future. And for places that have not had widespread infection already, you can get out of season hits as well. So the next 6 to 12 months in the United States, we're going to have more COVID waves. And it's going to come, and then 12 months after that, we're going to have more COVID waves. The key difference is that a large portion of the population now has some sort of immunity to COVID, either by dint of recovery after natural infection, or from the vaccines. And that immunity, the form that it takes is protection against severe disease on reinfection. So the epidemiological upshot of this is that you're going to see cases, but per case, we're going to see many fewer deaths and hospitalizations. There's going to be a decoupling of cases and severe disease. I think we're already seeing that in large parts of the world. And I think that fact is just going to be part of human existence from now on forward.
Right. But do you see, though, in terms of the media coverage, has there been a steady leakage of the amount of anxiety, or do you think that it still has unfortunately retained a hysterical tenor that is not borne out by the inevitability of future waves? Hopefully all my questions have been that leading.
Well, I mean, like, okay, I'll play amateur political scientist because that's all I really am. If on that front, what I see is that in large chunks of the U.S., mostly in red America, life is now normal. Like COVID is no longer a top of the mind kind of concern. You see this in opinion polls. Like people were worried about inflation, people were worried about their kids' schooling. These are all like sort of after effects of the lockdown. So it's COVID in disguise. But like if you ask them about are they worried about COVID, it doesn't show up in the top whatever. On the other hand, in some parts of blue America, especially like in California, right here where we live, it still is a thing. It still has some potence and power to move people. People are still worried about COVID in their lives. You still see people walking around outdoors with N95 masks on, and that's, I mean, that I think will start to dissipate over time. I don't think people can really live for so long in this idea with this focus on prevention of a single infectious disease as one of the main focuses of their life, when in fact there's so many other things in their life that matter. And I think over time that even in blue areas that it'll start to dissipate. I think the political winds will play a big role in this, right? I mean, I don't think it's an accident that we've seen many of the political leaders that were in favor of lockdown start to see get political comeuppance, right? So they're often not directly as I mean, at least on the surface, it doesn't look like it has to do with COVID. But I mean, Andrew Cuomo resigns his office on a sex scandal. But people were really unhappy that he sent COVID-infected patients into nursing homes. Boris Johnson is let go, not because of the lockdowns, but because he partied during the lockdowns. I guess. I mean, it's a lot of the political leaders. Now, there's been exceptions like Gavin Newsom, but you see Glenn Youngkin win, in part because of schooling, but not nominally, not because of COVID and interruptions in schooling by the previous government, but rather because of like some woke ideology. But really, it's about schooling, right? About the lockdowns. A lot of these like lockdown effects indirectly will change political fortunes, and that I think will lead in the next 6 to 12 months into a very, very different narrative.
Except Newsom. Newsom's always going to escape comeuppance. This is just, as a native Californian, I must have to deal with the fact that there might be justice in the next life, but not justice in this life. Not in terms of democratic politics in California. Homie's just going to skate by indefinitely. Final rapid fire thumbs up, thumbs down. You can provide a couple sentences of explanation, and I may prompt you for more. But if I don't prompt you, I want you to take these extremely complex issues and squish them into an artificial up-down binary. Okay? Tenure.
Thumbs up. Would have been thumbs down before the pandemic. It protected me from being fired, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah. But do you buy that for most tenured academics do not do what you do, which is take brave positions on issues of national importance and instead use it as an opportunity to basically retire early?
I don't know about most, but it's been disappointing to see that a lot of tenured faculty not step up even when they're seeing something wrong.
Right. Regular physical exercise.
Thumbs up. Although I have to say I don't do it as often as I probably ought. During the pandemic, I've done more. I now ride my bike to work much more than I used to.
What's your, on an average week, what is your exercise regime?
Mainly, I ride 5 miles into work and 5 miles back home 4 to 5 days a week.
Okay, good. Do you do any upper body work at all?
No
holistic.
I have not done very much of that, and I really ought to. Okay. I think it's a good idea, but it's hard to find the time for me.
Smartphones for adolescents.
I think thumbs down. I think on the whole, it's bad for adolescents to have access to it. I can understand why parents would want to be able to contact their kids no matter where they are, right. But on net, I think it's a harmful thing.
Don't give 13-year-old girls Instagram-equipped smartphones so that they can never escape vicious adolescent ranking of their attractiveness and place in the status hierarchy. Maybe not great long-term mental health.
I don't think it's a good idea. Well, when I was growing up, it was TV. How much TV should adolescents and kids watch?
I know. The one difference being that for the smartphone hysterics like myself, the mental health numbers do actually bear out some of our projections, whereas for television, they didn't. Well, yeah. So Palo Alto, thumbs up, thumbs down.
Beautiful place. I wish it were more tolerant of diverse thinking.
Right. Beautiful on the outside.
Beautiful in so many ways. Like a lot of very bright,
A little
talented
ugly in
people.
spirit, though. A little ugly in spirit.
You know, what did Solzhenitsyn say? He said the line between good and evil cuts through every human heart.
Yeah.
That's true in Palo Alto too.
Speaking of that great man, Jordan Peterson, thumbs up, thumbs down.
Thumbs up. Brave man. Don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but he is an honest man saying what he sees as the truth and meaning for there to be good in the world.
Right. 3 more. Alcohol.
I am not a big drinker, but I think in moderation is fine.
Define moderation.
If you are worried about drinking too much alcohol, you are drinking too much alcohol. Even if
Okay,
if you
that's
think,
a highly subjective standard, which I will heartily embrace.
Yeah, I think teetotaling is not. I don't think it's a virtue necessarily. I mean, for some people who have if they know that they drink even just a little bit, it's going to get them out of control. Then teetotaling is a good idea. I don't think we shouldn't be holding people to more like you're not a bad guy if you don't drink. You're not a bad guy if you do drink. It can be really harmful for some people, and for those people, they should work to try to cut it out of their lives.
Universal basic income.
I am a big supporter of the earned income tax credit. I think universal basic income produces worse incentives and worse outcomes and is more poorly targeted toward the vulnerable and the poor than alternatives.
So you like it where it's better targeted and also ideally is tied to some sort of work. Is that also some sort of participation in the labor market?
Yeah, I think a UBI that's divorced from work creates sort of bad incentives that we really don't need. Really, the purpose is to make sure the poor have an adequate living standard. And if you can tie it to an earned income tax credit, there may be people who are just utterly unable to work because of their disabilities or whatnot. Absolutely fine with transfers for them.
Yeah. Final question, Nick, are we okay? Yeah. Final question. Purely materialist explanation for human consciousness. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
You said complex questions in there's no way purely materialistic explanations can work for human consciousness. I don't believe it.
You sure we're not just little squirts here and there of neurochemicals?
We are squirts of neurochemicals, but we're not just squirts of neurochemicals.
Okay, all right. I agree with you, but I want to also retain my somewhat self-righteous atheism, and I'm having difficulty melding those two. I was hoping you could do it for me. And your recommendation can't just be go to church.
No, well, look, the religious position doesn't take a strong stance on whether it's material that it could just be material things that produce consciousness, and you can still be religious about it because it's God made the material things also.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a strong religious or Christian stance that one way or the other. I don't really understand some fellow religious of mine who think that. To me, it's just a question of science, and I just don't see any evidence. I mean, it's like the evidence seems to me like it's philosophically and scientifically difficult to show that you can do that. Once you produce a robot everyone agrees is like sentient, that'll change.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. J. Bhattacharya, thank you for being extremely generous with your time. You are a national hero, even if nobody at Stanford knows it. So thank you so much for coming on the channel.
My pleasure, Rob. It was really fun to talk with you.
Thank you.